Welcome to Dark Horse Auto and Diesel. In this video I'm going to show you how to replace the rear wheel bearing on a 2007 to 2014 Ford Edge. And I'm going to be covering the two-wheel drive and the all-wheel drive versions. I'll talk about the differences when they're relevant. So before you get started, there's a couple things you want to make sure you have. You will need a 32 millimeter or a 1.25 inch deep well socket, and that's to get your axle nuts off. And also you're going to want a T60 Torx bit. If you've got a two-wheel drive, you're fine with just a regular Torx bit. If you have an all-wheel drive, you're going to need one of these. This is a special tool. I'll put a link to where I bought it from. Now you can get these from your local Snap-on van, but they're really expensive there. I ended up getting this online. There's the package for it. This was the only place that I could find that actually had it in stock. And once we dig into it, you'll understand why this is so important. If you don't have this tool, you're going to have to remove the entire knuckle from the vehicle, and that's not going to be fun. So obviously the first thing you're going to have to do is get the thing up off the ground and get the wheel off. And if I need to explain how to do that to you, hi Cat, this is probably too complicated for you. Next we need to take our brake caliper off and also the bracket for it. And you can take this all off as one assembly if you want to. And if you want to do that, there's two 15 millimeter bolts. There's one there, one on the bottom, and just pull all this off together. Personally, I prefer to take the caliper off separate. I think it makes it easier, but you can do it however you want. To get the caliper off, there's two bolts. They're 14 millimeter, one right here, and then one right there. Then we'll gently pry the caliper off of here. Now, don't let this hang by the brake hose. Always hang this up because you can damage the hose. So just get like a tarp strap or some wire or something and find something to hang it up on. Next, we'll pull our brake pads off. Next, we'll take the caliper bracket off, and there's two 15 millimeter bolts. These are usually pretty tight, so you might want to get something for some extra leverage. I found that a socket fits pretty nicely over that. Next, we'll take our rotor off, and if this gets kind of stuck on there, it could be the parking brake is adjusted out too far. And what you can do is pop this little rubber plug out right here and get a screwdriver in there and turn the star wheel, and that'll adjust those brakes in a little bit. A lot of times you don't have to worry about that. As you can see, the parking brake stuff is already missing on this one. I'm not going to go into the reasons why, but you'll see once you get it off how you can make the adjustment on it. And if you do have to hit the rotor with a hammer to knock it loose, don't hit with a hard hammer. Use a block of wood or use a soft mallet to break it loose, because you definitely don't want that cracking on you. Next, what I'm going to do is remove the ABS sensor here. That's an 8 millimeter, and I'm just doing that to protect it, keep it from getting damaged while we're messing with other stuff. This is only going to be like this on the all-wheel drive versions. If you have a two-wheel drive, you're not going to have this problem. Next, we'll remove our axle nuts. Yes, nuts, plural. Not sure why they decided to put 2. 1.25 inch fits perfect on there, so that's what we're going to use. Next, you want to make sure this is loose, which mine thankfully is. A lot of times they'll get stuck, and there's a little hole there. They have pushers that attach to your lug nuts, and you just screw it in and push this in. or you can take a punch and stick it in there and hit it with a hammer. Don't hit directly on this with a hammer because you'll bork your threads up, and that's never a good day. So now you can actually see the end of the bolts here that we're going to be taking out. If yours still has the parking brake stuff in the way, you might not have quite as good of visibility. And I just want to mention, you do not have to take the parking brake stuff off. This one is just already gone for other reasons. Next we'll go on the back side and take these bolts off. If you've got a two-wheel drive, this is going to be much easier. Basically where the axle shaft is, there's going to be a plug up here. That's where your ABS sensor is. And then you'll just take the bolts out. If you've got an all-wheel drive like this one, this is where this special tool comes in play, because you can see these Torx bolts here, but that tone ring for the ABS sensor is in the way, so you can't get a regular Torx socket in there. And that's where this one, having it kind of inset in here, allows you to get it onto the head of the bolt. So we'll get all four of those loosened up, and I would recommend leaving the top two partially threaded in so that things don't fall off. And conveniently, this tool is just too long where it starts interfering with the spring here when you put your ratchet on it. And if you're running into that problem, just take a wrench. This part here is a half-inch out of frustration, I'm going to be modifying this tool, and I'm going to show you what I'm going to do. Since we're having clearance issues with the spring, you may not have that problem, but on mine, clearly I am. So, just going to drive that part out of there. And I've already kind of measured it out a little bit, and I'm going to cut about that much of it off, right about where that socket left a little bit of a line there. Shorten that up a little bit. That ought to work better. Now let's see if I cut it too short. Oh man, that's like perfect. Next, what we'll do is just give it a couple good whacks right along in here on this ring to separate it from the backing plate. Make sure there's not a whole bunch of rust or anything on there, and then we can get this slid back on for the time being. And now we can start the reassembly process. I got my part here from Detroit Axle. I'm not sponsored by them or anything, but I've had good luck with their parts. I've got a set of them on my work truck, and they have well over 100,000 miles on them, and they're still doing fine, whereas I've had a set of Timkins fail on me in about 20,000. So these are reasonably priced as well. And before you install the new bearing, I'd recommend putting a little bit of grease on the shaft here. It just helps keep it from corroding, and if you ever do have to take this back apart, it makes it a heck of a lot easier because the shaft won't be stuck in the bearing. Now if you have a two-wheel drive, this is going to be significantly easier. And then before we thread these into our bearing, we're going to take a little bit of red thread locker and stick on there. Technically, you're supposed to use new bolts because they have a heat activated thread locker that once you tighten them up, the heat from torquing them down activates it, but not exactly necessary. All I'm doing right now is just getting them started. And now all I'm doing is just snugging them up in a cross pattern, just lightly snugging them. And then I'll take you around to the back side and we'll put the final torque on them. Now this is important to note. I don't know why there's a difference, but according to the book there is. These 4 bolts here, if you have a 2007 to 2010, you're going to torque them to 98 foot-pounds. If you have an 11 to 14, you're going to torque them to 85. So if you're in a shop with a lift, you won't really have this problem. But the issue I'm running into is there's not really enough room for me to swing my 1/2-inch torque wrench around under here and not hit the floor. I just don't have it up high enough, and I don't think I can get it high enough off the floor to do that. So I'm using my 3/8-inch torque wrench, and what I did was I just took this back out of the end of it and using a 1/2-inch socket on the end of it, like so, and getting in there and torquing it that way. Next we'll put a rotor back on, and you obviously notice that the parking brake stuff isn't on there yet. That's going to be done at a later time. The customer can't really afford to do it right now. I advised otherwise, but it is what it is. Don't judge me or her. Then we'll take our caliper bracket and get it put on. And then we'll torque these 2 bolts down to 66 foot-pounds. Then get our brake pads put back into the bracket. Grab our caliper, get it installed. Then torque these 2 bolts to 19 foot-pounds. Now we can get our ABS sensor put back in. I don't have a torque spec for this, just snug. Now if you have a parking brake mechanism in there, you're going to want to tighten it up, like I said, through this here. Obviously I'm not going to mess with that because there's nothing there. But if you do, just turn the wheel until you just start to feel a little bit of resistance, and then back it up just a little bit. You want it to where it's almost touching this, but not dragging. Now what I'm going to do is get the inner axle nut just kind of snugged up with the impact, very gently. Now you've got to find some way to hold this from spinning while you torque this down. You do not want to set any weight down on this until these nuts are torqued down, or nut, depending on what year you have. So what I'm going to end up doing is have an assistant hold the brakes for me while I torque that nut down. If yours is like this one, a 2007 to 10, you'll have the 2 nuts set up, and the inner nut is going to be 203 foot-pounds, 203, and the outer will be 129. And if you have an 11 to 14, it's just 1 nut, and it's 258 foot-pounds, 258. You could also use the parking brake to hold that from spinning if you have one. Now we'll get the second nut put on. Next we'll get our tire put back on. set back on the ground and then torque our lug nuts to 100 foot-pounds. Now, since we had the brakes off, when you start it up, make sure you pump them up a little bit before you just go throwing it in gear, because otherwise it might take off on you. And the final and possibly most important step of all. Celebration beer.